Welcome to the Painting of the Week podcast, where we look at some of the most significant paintings throughout history. Introducing your hosts, Phil Grabsky and Laura Bentham.
Welcome to this week's Painting of the Week. Good to have you with us. And today we're talking about a very interesting painting called Olive Grove, Saint Remy, from November 1889 by Vincent van Gogh. And I know in the Painting of the Week podcast we've done Vincent, more than once, and I think that's perfectly justifiable because I think he's the most extraordinary artist. Some of you may be listening to this podcast while the exhibition Van Gogh, Poets and Lovers is still on at the National Gallery in London. And if you're listening to this after November the 7th, 2024, hopefully you've had the opportunity to see our film of the same name, which I was filming a couple of days ago. And the exhibition has 61 artworks, and you'd be hard-pressed not to want any of them on your living room wall. And I don't mean that just for the financial benefit. I just think they are almost all quite extraordinary. So Laura and I have chosen Olive Grove, Saint Remy, and we'll talk about that in a second. First of all, just to remind you, if you go to the 7th-art.com website and click on podcast, you can see the painting, or even go to our YouTube channel. And same thing, you can listen to the podcast and look at the painting. So, Laura, good afternoon. As we look out onto a northern European skyline where the olive is clearly completely absent, apart from a few ornamental ones and occasional gardens. What do you think of this painting?
Well, firstly, Phil, it's just so lovely that we're actually looking at it in a book. Sorry to be old and old-fashioned, but this book is absolutely glorious. This book of all the paintings, 15 of them in this one book. And these, I didn't know there was 15.
Well, hold on a second, we should say what the book is.
Oh, okay.
So,
let's say that.
We're looking at the painting in a catalogue, Van Gogh and the Olive Groves, which was an exhibition held in 2022, just after COVID, in Dallas. And I think it was a cooperation with the Van Gogh Museum, so it must have gone there as well. And it basically looks at one of the things we're going to talk about, which was, towards the end of his life, Van Gogh, he started doing something known as repetition, so repetitions, where he's taking a similar scene and or object and painting multiple versions of it.
Oh, okay. Does a lot of artists do that then? Is that I didn't know that was a thing.
I wouldn't say all artists do it. I mean, famously with Van Gogh, people probably know that there were, a number of sunflowers.
Yeah.
The famous sunflowers in the vase, he did 7 of those.
Oh, okay.
There are some other sunflowers he did as well. Monet was very famous for doing multiple paintings of Rouen Cathedral, grain stacks, and usually it's for Rouen Cathedral, for example, it's essentially the same position that he takes, but he's trying to capture how light at different times of day.
Oh, okay. So in these olive groves then, Van Gogh is trying to capture, it looks like different seasons. I totally love them, Phil. There's my first opinion, because when you said we're doing olive groves, obviously straight in, started looking at them, and I was like, whoa, they're extraordinary. They're not like any olive groves I've seen. They're just so colourful, beautiful, energy, loads of fun. I feel like they've got fun in them, actually. Because there's no real detail.
Okay, so that's a really interesting point there. And one of the things that the exhibition and our film is trying to get across is the complete misunderstanding of who Vincent van Gogh was.
Okay.
People and, Kirk Douglas and even the representations more recently by actors like Benedict Cumberbatch, I think have misrepresented Van Gogh to suggest or give the impression that his art is an expression of his mental ill health.
Right.
And that isn't the case. Basically, he knew he had mental health issues, but when he had them, he didn't paint.
No.
This is actually a painter who was extraordinarily well prepared, in the sense that he was extraordinarily literate. He read very widely, poetry, for example. He studied other artists, past and present. He thought very, very carefully. And even though he was only an artist for 10 years, the last 10 years of his life, so it's a short period, but he was prolific. But just because he was prolific doesn't mean that these were hastily thought through.
Right.
We're very fortunate that we have a remarkable record of his thought processes, because about 900 of his letters have survived. It's the same with Mozart, where over 800 letters of his have survived. Monet, when I made the film about Monet, just based on his letters, there's over 3,000. So when an artist travels, that gives his posterity or future generations the potential of a great advantage, which is that these artists write home.
Yeah.
And then if you're lucky, the recipient keeps the letters because they recognise their value. Of course, if somebody's living at home, they're not writing letters, so you don't have any. And if somebody chooses to, they either don't keep them. In my family, there's a moment in history which was my father's biggest regret, was that a whole wicker basket of letters that came from his mother's side out of Poland leading up to and during the war were subsequently thrown away, which he never, ever regretted.
Oh, so yeah. So can I ask a question quickly then, Phil?
Yes.
So the exhibition, Poets and Lovers.
Yeah.
There's obviously lots of letters there. What's the lovers part?
Okay, so...
Sorry, I've gone right off the painting, sorry.
No, well, it's not. It's actually... The point I was going to make about the painting, and then I'll answer that, is that this is if you know the chronology of Van Gogh's life, so it's painted in November 1889, but from May 1889 to May 1890, he's in the what some have called an asylum, others will call a hospital. Because of his ill health. Essentially self-admitted. Because he was aware that he was having these moments of ill health. One doctor suggested it was epilepsy, others have subsequently suggested maybe it was bipolar. Obviously we know about the famous incident with his ear, but that was partly the outpouring of frustration that his dream of an artistic community based on his relationship with Gauguin, who'd come down to the south, to the house that Van Gogh had rented and decorated, and he'd done these paintings of sunflowers and all sorts of other things and put them on the wall, and tried to make it the perfect artistic studio and living space for him and Gauguin, and it didn't work. He and Gauguin had a big row, and with a shaving knife, we assume he cut off some or part of his ear. Some or all of his ear.
So it was actually quite a kind man, really, then. He kind of got let down all the time.
What Van Gogh, and this then answers your other question, which is that... No, but that's... I think that there's enormous love and compassion in Van Gogh. Part of that comes from his biography. One of 6 children... his father was a little stern, but it was a middle-class upbringing in the Netherlands. Comfortable. Again, extremely well-read. And, Van Gogh has these various opportunities for the life that he can lead. His sisters' lives are all very interesting. His brother Theo, probably the most famous other sibling, becomes a successful art dealer in Paris. And Van Gogh is just extraordinarily unlucky in love.
Oh, okay.
So whereas Theo is fortunate and he marries a woman called Jo, and Jo ultimately is the one that keeps all the letters and many of the paintings, and she becomes the guardian of the Van Gogh legacy in much the same way as Constanza did for Wolfgang Mozart. Vincent never has that. He falls in love with people that are either already betrothed or just are not interested. There's a relationship with a woman called Scene, who is often referred to as a prostitute, but she was a seamstress and she may well have prostituted herself for money, but she was very poor. It wasn't the only thing that she did, but anyway, it was a difficult relationship. There was a child, which was almost certainly not Van Gogh's, but some have suggested it may have been. I don't know.
Okay, right.
But
there we are.
Basically, by the time he gets to Arles, his relationships are, according to one of his own letters, the fortnightly trip to the brothel.
Right.
So it is possible to see in his paintings a yearning for a relationship with a woman which he himself never attains. In many of his paintings, most of his landscapes, there are people.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked in another podcast about Starry Night over the Rhone, where there is a couple there. He's put that couple in, and some have suggested that's his own aspiration for that to be him. Hard to know that for sure. Somebody else has suggested that, he comes from the Netherlands, which is a very small country with a reasonably busy population, and that there was always people. You could also argue it's just to add scale to a painting. You could argue it's just to add narrative. There's various reasons why you would put people in it. But this sense of poetry and love, because of course it's the first question we ask of the curators, why do you call it Poets and Lovers?
Yeah.
If you start to untangle and look at the paintings he does in this 2-year period, so basically the exhibition focuses on the most important 2 years of his artistic life, one could argue, which is when he's in the south of France.
Mm-hmm.
So if I can get this right, it's 27 months, I think it is, from 1888 to 1890. He goes to Arles, gets off the train in Arles, and he stays there for just over 2 years. So basically he's in Arles, and then he's in Saint Remy, which is just up the road, in the asylum, in the hospital. In that period, he paints an enormous amount of paintings.
Right, okay.
And the representation of poetry and of love is a consistent theme. Let's take that a bit further. When we talk about poetry and love, that doesn't mean that lovers are represented necessarily in a painting every time. It also is reflecting two things in terms of poetry. For example, any artwork, any film that I make, any creation that you make when you're sewing something is actually an expression of our own backgrounds, our own histories. Van Gogh was, as I said, extremely well read. I mean, he could speak 5 languages. He would read the American poets and he talks about Dickens and Dante and Plutarch and poets are a substantial part of that. So poetry is part of the way that he understands the world. And again, it's an easy thing to say, an obvious thing to say. There's no television, there's no movies. Mm-hmm. In the evenings, they read. When he wasn't painting, he's reading or writing letters. There's also the analogy with poetry in that poetry is about being very considered about the words that you use and the rhythm in which they're presented. and in a sense, you could make a comparison to the way that he paints. Everything's very carefully chosen, and there's a rhythm to it. Certain words, or in this case, images will jump out. Basically, he's a poet in paint.
Yeah.
And that's certainly the argument that the exhibition curators are making, which is you've got to stop thinking of Van Gogh as some kind of crazy guy that just splashes paint about and look, it kind of works. And part of the reason it works is because it's colourful and we like colour. And okay, let's move on to the next one. That does him such an injustice. And in terms of love, I think that, again, you wouldn't get this from seeing like a recent film where Willem Dafoe plays him. You know, this is a man who is in search of community and relationships, and indeed a loving relationship. Now, maybe his personality, maybe the fact that he didn't wash enough, or that he was not that careful about what he wore. There's evidence, suggestions that, you know, he certainly we know he lost a lot of teeth. He probably had some wooden false teeth. I mean, maybe presentationally he wasn't great. Maybe.
Not with the wooden false teeth.
No, I mean, but, you know, there's a yearning there for, you know, a relationship that never quite happens. And even this whole relationship with Gauguin, it's kind of sad. He invests so much in getting that to work.
Yeah.
But he's probably too intense for Gauguin, or Gauguin will say, "Come on, we've painted enough now. Let's go down to the pub or whatever." And Van Gogh's, "No, I want to talk more about."
Yeah. It's funny because then maybe when he arrived then, for that final 2 years in the hospital, and if you're saying that he's painting when he's calm,
yeah,
that he actually maybe loved that final 2 years, if that was the most creative he was.
Well, so he's not in the hospital for 2 years. He's in the hospital for a year.
Right.
But there's absolutely a point at which when he actually leaves Arles, he goes back north and he goes straight through Paris. He says Paris is way too frenetic for me.
Right.
He goes to a place called Auvers-sur-Oise because it's calm. He needs somewhere calm. I get it. I mean, you know, we have chosen to live in Brighton, which is still a busy town, but not in London.
No.
When I recently went to Paris, it was so frenetic and so busy that was, for me, more of a negative than the positive of all the possibilities of Paris. So I kind of get why you want peace and quiet. He needed peace and quiet. And, you know, these mentalish episodes were obviously quite, you know, he couldn't remember. People suggested that it was suggested that once he tried to eat paint and...
Oh, yeah, I saw that, yeah.
But I mean, I think he would basically collapse. So in the asylum, now he's there for a year in this hospital, so there came a point when he'd had enough. But yeah, there's definitely a time there where he was... There was a, you know, like so many of the artists that we've made films about and that you and I have talked about, actually what they want to do practically all the time is just get better at their craft. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you can imagine that there's no distractions.
No.
Somebody's feeding him he didn't care too much about food. He's being fed 3 times a day. He's got a room. In the hospital, he had 2 rooms, his bedroom, and then the director, who seems like a very interesting guy, quite supportive, made sure that Van Gogh had a studio. Initially, he wasn't allowed out, but then he was allowed out, and he was allowed out to go to the local. So some of the paintings from this period are you see some paintings where he does some interior views.
Right, okay.
Then you see paintings where he's looking out of the window. Mm-hmm. There are also paintings where he's painting the gardens and the courtyard of the hospital itself. Interestingly, for example, it was all male, but he puts a woman in there. Again, he's introducing narrative.
Yeah, he must have loved the routine then.
But then he's allowed out.
Oh, okay.
He's allowed out with this, so that's when he goes out to to paint the olive groves. And yeah, that kind of routine. And he says, you know, there are some people here that are ranting and raving, but he said there's so much friendship, there's so much more.
Yeah, that's nice.
You know, in some ways he's optimistic. He's always seeking
So that's why he picked your surroundings, the olive groves, and then every day, or over a period of time, and in amongst all the other paintings, just getting out there and painting them different lights, different seasons. They're evergreens, aren't they? So
I think there's two really interesting things to say about the olive groves. One is in terms of the technique, and the other is in terms of the narrative. Let's start with the narrative, maybe. So this painting from Gothenburg, the reason I chose that, and you mentioned there were 15, is that right?
15, it says.
There's 15 olive groves.
I'm sure that if anyone's got any others, please let us know.
Okay.
It says 15.
So you did 15 olive groves, okay. The reason I chose the one from Gothenburg was because I went there 3 weeks ago.
Oh, brilliant.
And I actually went to the Gothenburg Museum of Art, and I think we'll post a picture somewhere on the website or somewhere of me standing in front of the whole, the space on the wall.
Oh, okay.
Because the painting, I talked to them and they said, the painting's already packaged up and ready to go to London. So, because I was going to talk to a curator about the painting. What has to be said is that, as far as I can tell, this is their star painting.
Oh, right.
It basically had a wall to itself, and so it's quite something that they've lent it for essentially 4 months.
Definitely. What are they going to do?
Well, I just see from the picture at the moment there's just nothing there but a sign saying sorry.
Oh, no.
Interestingly, as an aside, in the National Gallery, I've never noticed this before, it's something I learned, they've lent, if you like, 4 of their own Van Goghs to the exhibition.
Right.
So they've come out of permanent collection and gone into the temporary exhibition.
Yeah.
Which means if you went to the National Gallery tomorrow to see the sunflowers, which normally, of course, we have a wonderful National Gallery that's free.
Yeah.
You couldn't see them because they're in the temporary exhibition.
Oh, okay.
That you have to pay to get into. Now, in other permanent collections, when a painting comes off the wall, they either just put a sign up saying, sorry, this isn't here for the next 16 weeks, or they replace it with something else and hope people don't notice. What the National have done, which is interesting, is they've, certainly one, I think maybe two of the 4, they've loaned another Van Gogh from somebody else.
Oh.
So they've loaned, there's a really nice Van Gogh, which is, when he got on the train to Arles and went south, he was going south to the sunny Provençal sun. And he was in search of his kind of Japan, and which we've talked about before, but he was expecting a certain light. And anyway, when he got to Arles, it was snowing, which he hadn't really anticipated.
No.
So his first painting is of this snowy scene.
Right.
That painting, the National's just loaned, I think from a private collector, so thank you to the private collector. So they've replaced the Van Gogh with a Van Gogh.
Well, that's nice.
Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, very nice.
Anyway, Gothenburg.
Haven't got an empty wall.
Got an empty wall. So to some extent chosen at random by me, just because I was in Gothenburg. Now, I think that the narrative of olive groves is really interesting. Again, this is what we're always encouraging people to do and what we talk about in our podcast, which is you could just look at that and think, oh, olive groves, interesting.
Yeah.
And move on.
Yes.
But I think there's two ways you need to look at this, first of all. 3 ways. One is the biography of the artist that we've talked about. The second way is, well, is there more to the choice of olive grove than just that was what was in front of him? The answer is yes, there is. So the olive, he's from the north he's from Northern Europe, where they don't have olive groves. Olive groves actually pretty much don't grow much further north than where these are in Arles.
Yeah.
They are susceptible to the cold and to frost. And if you look at these olive groves, you'll notice how the roots have been covered with earth. That's to protect them against any cold weather. These olives did not survive a very severe frost that happened in subsequent years. So if you go down south of France now and you look for olives,
Not there.
there'll be olives, but they're not,
Oh,
they're not
okay.
these. Olives can last this
Yeah.
long, but frost, like vines, olives, like vines, can be killed by frost. Anyway, so the olives, to some extent, represent the south. Van Gogh makes reference in a letter to the fact the olives in the south are like the willow trees in the north, distinctive to a particular part. They have a real history to them. It's interesting that Van Gogh, in the south of France, in Arles, where he's surrounded by echoes of ancient Rome, wasn't interested.
Right.
Didn't paint the amphitheatre or the sarcophagi, which are on a road nearby, but he was very tuned into classical history. And part of the fact that he would have known that the Romans would have planted olives, would have eaten olives, would have transported olive oil in their amphorae around the Mediterranean, Mare Nostrum, our sea. He'd have known that it would have been part of the texture of his choice for choosing olives. He also would know that the olive was hugely important to contemporary culture at the time and the economy. So some of the paintings, like if you want to look up the Kröller-Müller Museum one from December 1889, you can see people who are picking the olives. Van Gogh himself used to like eating olives. So they're also representing local culture and so forth. There is a view that the way in which the trunks and the branches are so gnarled allows him to represent them in however you want to interpret it, as human forms, as dancers, as, he could be as expressive as he likes.
They do look like it.
Yeah.
For sure.
So there's all that. So there's kind of a historical bent to them, but then there's the visual side of it. Now, Van Gogh is like his contemporaries. One of the things I learnt this weekend, which actually I didn't know, one of the curators said this in one of the interviews. All modern artists working at this time were basically broadly considered impressionists. It was almost like an alternative term for modern artist. And actually, when I looked at the letters today, having heard that comment, it's true. He refers to himself as, an impressionist. Even though what's so striking about him is that, you wouldn't really, if you saw a Van Gogh up against a Monet, you'd know who was who.
Right.
But like the Impressionists, and unlike previous generations of artists, the Impressionists start on very light, with a light background, a light ground, and they build up on it with colours really quite quickly. If you ever look at a Rembrandt or a Vermeer, they tend to be quite dark grounds, brown grounds, ochre, and they build up. They might even sketch out. You can tell that what Van Gogh's doing is he's got his canvas. Very, very frequently, they are what are known as number 30 canvases. You'd basically go into an art shop and ask for a certain canvas.
Oh, okay, type and type.
Number 28, number 32. Number 30 was the size he liked. He refers to them in his letters quite often, a number 30 canvas. Something quite interesting about that too, which is that it means he gets used to working in a certain format. He's not doing different, that helps him to, when we make the comparisons between these paintings, the fact that they're all kind of essentially the same shape, with the same initial background, makes it easier for us to compare. Then he's working with colour in a really pretty radical way. He himself talks about the fact that the future belongs to the colourists. He was talking about
Didn't he
himself.
study it as well? I thought he studied it as well.
There is in the 19th century, a huge amount of effort that goes into the study of colour and how it works on the brain. And so artists at this time are all very well tuned into, colour wheels and the impact of complementary colours. And you see that in Van Gogh over and over again. It is not an accident that he talks about the 6 primary colours, and it's not an accident that he's putting, reds and blues next to each other, greens and reds, blues and yellows, oranges and greens. And what he's trying to do time and time again is to see what the impact is of doing that, how it affects the rhythm of a painting, how it affects the way in which your eyes are interpreting the painting.
Well, it's funny you say that, because the rhythm, you can look at that painting now I'm really staring at it, and there's just so much movement in that painting. Yeah. And down in sort of the Mediterranean countries that I've been, it's always quite windy, and you can actually almost feel the wind going through those paintings. And then when you were saying there's 15 and not a lot of them have got people in them, the one we're looking at especially, it is a little bit lonely.
Well, I was saying that many of them do have people in.
Yeah.
But you're right. The absence of the person.
Is he feeling a bit? I don't know. Is he isolated? I suppose you could analyse that anyway. But the movement in that painting comes across so well. Unless you don't really paint wind, do you? Unless you've got a person in there showing it.
But it's not a still day.
No.
I mean, if he'd had a completely blue, azure blue sky, and that's what he's doing here. He's almost subconsciously suggesting things. So the ground could almost be like a mangrove swamp, couldn't it? And that's like water.
And that blue is stunning, that colour.
And those patches of blue, and they, he's a very talented painter. Things are getting slightly smaller and diminished as we go back. So you've got this real sense of depth. I feel if you look in the middle of the painting, I go, like so many people, I go walking and running in the woods. I feel I could run down that path to the back of the painting without any trouble at all. I kind of feel like I know how it would feel, I know how it would smell. He's trying to get across that sense of the heat of the day, the smell of the ground, of the whole area.
And it is a beautiful day. You can see it's a beautiful day.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I was just wondering what that yellow is saying to me about what do I actually think. I guess I feel for me this is kind of a end of day.
Okay.
I mean,
sun's just gone down.
He wouldn't have had long. I mean, he painted fast. Yeah. And if you are, again, fabulous interview in the film, Lachlan Gowdy, who's a wonderful painter, he was looking at this and one or two other paintings, and he was saying, I can tell so much just from the brushstroke.
Oh, amazing.
You can see how he's put some bold colour on his brush, and he talks about the type of brush that he uses, and he's just laid it on so quickly with a little flick at the end.
Yeah.
So you can see it's slightly longer at the start, it moves up and it flicks off. But he said, you're working in outdoor conditions, it's windy, the canvas might be flapping about.
Yeah.
Really quite difficult to do, and he's probably done the bulk of this in maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours. And
it is just pure paint and brushstrokes, because there isn't any detail there, really, and then it all just comes together. It's absolutely gorgeous.
It's definitely one where it's a really good example of the more you look at it, the better it becomes.
No, it's really lovely, because I've just sat here for 30 minutes drinking a nice coffee that Phil made me. And I have actually, the more I looked at it, the more I thought, oh, well, I love this. And I'm assuming as soon as you get in front of it with the colours...
Well, that's interesting to see, because in the exhibition, I've got to be honest, it's slightly... it's fighting for attention, because there's 6 rooms and they've got absolute works of art.
Oh, okay, fine.
Time and time and time again, masterpieces.
Have they got a couple of olive groves in there?
Yeah.
Okay, so you have some to compare it to.
Yeah.
Oh, lovely.
Again, if we think about if people have looked up the olive grove with 2 olive pickers from the Krula Mula. It's so different. Oh, actually, what is it? Actually, thinking about it, the sky's still got that yellowy sky. There's far less. I mean, there's a much lighter blue, far less brown. They've got people picking the olives, which obviously changes everything because all of a sudden, the same olive grove suddenly seems smaller, with people standing in front of them.
Yeah, but the actual trees themselves look the same.
Yeah, it's obviously the same spot.
But there was one I loved, olive trees with a yellow sky and sun. And it had a big sun. It was beautiful. So
he liked his big suns because there's a really great painting, very important painting in the exhibition called The Sower.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I absolutely love that. I wrote it down.
Oh, there you go.
When I was looking through.
And that's a really interesting one because...
Oh, that's gorgeous.
The sun is actually a halo. I mean, it's actually, it's a halo on that person. There's a big yellow sun, so it's all about life affirming. But then he's got this branch or trunk that goes straight through the plane.
I really love that painting.
I mean, it's quite... it's a painting that's it's an expression of an artist who's willing to do anything and try anything. That's a really interesting one, actually. And maybe that's what he's trying to say with the yellow here. He's suffusing the olives with the kind of energy-giving sunlight that they need. And maybe if it was just as kind of a pale blue or an azure blue sky, it would be all a little less...
Does it confirm? I mean, was that his favourite colour? Because when he did that house, he called it the Yellow House.
There's a lot of yellow in what he does, yeah. I think the light, the association with sunlight is very strong for him.
Maybe it's quite a positive colour.
It's also, we've talked about this before, modern technologies move on, so they're starting to get new synthetic paints, which are really very bright too, which he's able to take advantage of. It's so sad for him. Within, I don't know, 25 years, he is probably the most famous artist in the world. He's already been copied, which is, but in his own lifetime, he sells barely a handful. And
he wanted to, with that on the Yellow House, create something where he could give back to people, sort of, sort of like without any money, and give to the poor. And now you look at him now, what he could have done.
And there'll be, people who get his paintings, but probably don't give enough to the poor.
Yeah, I don't know, because that's what he kind of wanted to create, wasn't it?
He was always thinking, in his letters are so revealing, he's always thinking, where's this painting going to go? Whose house is it going to decorate? Who's going to look at it? I think that's really interesting. And he's often saying, oh, this one would work well in your room, or give this to mum, or he's doing them for an exhibition that he wants his brother to hold to try and sell some. Yeah,
because he wanted to care, because he was really always wanted to look after him, didn't he, as well? Because even though Theo was always looking after...
I mean, the equivalent for me... Theo was always
looking after him.
The equivalent for me would be, which I never seem to get the time to do, but where you have a scene, a cut scene, but you try it with all sorts of different types of soundtracks. So maybe you get 5 different composers to compare, and you just see the difference.
Yeah.
So actually, what Van Gogh is doing here is he's experimenting with his form in a way that I don't do, or don't have the time to do, or don't make the time to do, which is the same scene, like these olive groves, but what happens if we shoot it in a different aspect ratio? So rather than what is now the normal, which is called 16:9, funnily enough, it used to be 4:3, which is pretty much what Van Gogh has here, isn't it? Four units across and 3 units down. What about if we went to how they used to do the spaghetti westerns, which is like Cinerama, which is a much thinner frame? Or what about if we played with the colour in some way? Or what about if we, as I say, had a different composer do a different score?
Yeah.
And just see what that does. I mean, the music score is probably the best example of the difference it could make. he has, because he can work fast, which he clearly can, he has that advantage of just seeing, and then he would he'd let them sit in his studio, and then he'd look at them, and he might add something to them, probably wouldn't, but then he can compare. So, you were saying he did 15, he'd probably at some point look at them and think, do you know what, I think, the lighter green trees with the yellow sky actually became a bit flat, whereas the darker green olive trees stood out a bit more against that pale,
who knows?
Anyway.
People can analyse, can't they? But really,
there's so much to him.
We're so lucky to be able to go to that exhibition then.
Well,
and get an insight into it.
If you can't get to the exhibition,
exactly,
which is at the National Gallery until January 2025. So for those of you listening to this in 2075, hello. But you've missed the exhibition. But our film is no doubt still available. Talk to my great grandkids and they'll sort you out.
Oh, that'd be lovely, wouldn't it?
Or, of course, there's the catalogue.
Yes.
Or, you can see some of these paintings. You can just go and see individual works. The one interesting thing about Van Gogh, the one benefit from the fact that he didn't sell plenty of paintings in his lifetime, is that Theo's wife and then descendants ended up with a lot, which they ultimately gave to what has ultimately become the Van Gogh Museum.
Oh, yes.
So if you go to the Van Gogh Museum, that is the most extraordinary permanent collection of Van Gogh's works, not to be missed. You can go there many, many times.
I'm going to put that on my list.
If you're a lover of Monet, because Monet sold so much in his lifetime, you can go to any of the many, many extraordinarily good American galleries, for example, and they'll all have a wonderful Monet. So you have to do a lot of travelling if you want to see all the great classics of Monet or Manet or Renoir or Degas.
Yeah.
Van Gogh is I'm trying to think if there's another example. He's the example par excellence of where one gallery has an enormous amount of his work.
Which is lovely, yeah.
On the other hand, this National Gallery exhibition, interestingly enough, it's rather surprisingly, is the first major exhibition that the National Gallery have ever done of Van Gogh's works. And although we did film 20 odd years ago the Letters of Van Gogh at, I think, the Royal Academy, arguably this is the most significant Van Gogh exhibition ever in this country, and probably one of the most significant. I mean, when you see the paintings that they've got, it's got to be one of the most significant Van Gogh exhibitions ever. And it's so difficult. Like we were talking about Gothenburg, for Gothenburg Museum of Art to lend its prime artwork for 4 months, and some of the other artworks, and there's some private collectors. There's one painting that springs to mind, hasn't been seen since 1990.
Oh, amazing.
So the exhibition, the film, the catalogue,
everything.
Look at them all. And sometimes have a look at a painting that you don't know and maybe at first glance doesn't arrest you in quite the same way as the Yellow House or Sunflowers or Starry Night over the Rhone, like Olive Grove, Saint Remy, because, it can give back an enormous amount of
It did to me.
pleasure.
I've had a wonderful week.
Very good. Well, as ever, thank you for listening. There's more than 60 more podcasts you can listen to. Please, if you do enjoy the podcast, do us a favour and let one person know. Encourage one more person to listen. And do visit the 7th-art.com shop if you want to see, download, stream, buy the DVD of previous Van Gogh films that we've made, or any of the other Impressionist painters, Post-Impressionist, and so on. Thank you very much. We'll see you again soon.
Perfect.
Thank you for listening to the Painting of the Week podcast. For more information, please visit our website at 7th-art.com. or contact us by emailing info@seventh-art.com. See you next time.